Today's episode discusses the death of individuals. If this sort of thing upsets you, may I suggest you watch a movie, maybe something like Taxi Driver.
Welcome to Mayhem in the Morgue, with your host, Dr. Kendall Crowns.
Today's episode, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Towards the end of residency in Memphis, one of our cars broke down and we couldn't afford to get it fixed. So Beth and I only had one car between the two of us. The car was a Ford Escort station wagon. Its color was purple. The exact name from the Ford company was Royal Plum. In residency, my co-residents called it the Barney-Mobile. And when we moved to the suburbs of Chicago, work was about 50 minutes away from our house. And the best part was, I could use public transportation, so we didn't need to buy a second car. Every day, to get to work, I would typically use the trains, occasionally buses, and all these modes of public transportation were excellent. For the most part, it ran usually on time and was usually comfortable and warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and for the most part it was clean. The first train I would board would be around 4:50 a.m. in the morning. It was about a half mile or so from my house, and I would walk to the station. It was run by Metra, which is a public transportation system and is the main commuter rail system serving the city of Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. It's the fourth busiest commuter rail system in the United States. These trains are huge. They're usually multiple cars, and the cars have two decks to them, a lower and an upper one. They are clean, well-maintained, and have conductors that would walk through and punch your ticket every day and make sure no one was misbehaving. I would usually sit on the upper deck and sleep until we would reach the station, and if I slept too hard, the conductor would wake me up by banging his metal hole punch on the railing and tell me to wake up. We're at the station. The station the trip would end at was Union Station in Chicago. I would leave the train, walk through Union Station, and walk another couple blocks to the Underground Station on Clinton Street, and take the Blue Line L train to work. The L, which is short for elevated, is another rapid transport rail system that serves the city of Chicago and some suburbs. It's the third busiest rapid transport system in the United States, and is run by the Chicago Transport Authority. There are 8 different lines that are given color designations, although when I was riding the trains, there was no pink line back then. These trains operate 24 hours a day, they're fairly reliable, and somewhat clean. I did learn early on, though, never to sit in a seat if it was the only one open, because probably someone had urinated in it, and that's why no one was sitting in it. I also saw something come out of every orifice from other riders during my time on the L. It was definitely an experience. I rode the Blue Line train from the Clinton Street station for 3 stops, and I would get off at the stop labeled Illinois Medical District. Once I got off the train, I had to walk another 3 blocks to the medical examiner's office. The total commute time was about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on which train I caught, and if the L trains were running on time. And that was my commute every day. Never really changed, except every so often I would take a CTA bus instead of the L. Sometimes, when I would be at work, I would have to go downtown, usually for court or a deposition. As I mentioned in a previous episode, the courthouse at 26th in California was the main one I would go to, and that one I could reach by a Blue Line L train that ran to 54th and Cermak, which is now the Pink Line. But when I had to go other places that I couldn't use the L for, I would take a taxi. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is a couple of these taxi ride experiences I had while working in Cook County. I took a taxi several times in Cook County while I worked there, and most of the time it was uneventful. The individual would pick me up, take me from point A to point B, not really say much of anything, and the ride would be pleasant. Other times, the person would be erratic, talking way too much, speeding, and doing lots of lane changes. And it always was a little frightening, but ultimately I never died. One of these crazy rides occurred in the last few days of February. I was finishing up my second year at the office, and I was scheduled to do my very first deposition. A deposition is an out-of-court testimony. It typically takes place in an office building, sometimes in a hotel conference room. It just depends. It's just not in a formal courthouse. I would be sworn in and provide testimony. It is during the discovery phase, typically of a civil lawsuit, and it gives the attorneys the opportunity to gather information relevant to the case, and they can get quite heated. The location of this deposition was downtown on Upper Wacker Drive. If you're unfamiliar with Wacker Drive, it is a street in downtown Chicago that is 2 miles long and composed of 3 different levels that go by the names of Upper Wacker, Lower Wacker, and Lower Wacker. Upper Wacker was where I was heading. It has high-rise office buildings and hotels along it that loom over the Chicago River and is very picturesque. Lower Wacker is the basement level of the buildings that accommodates through traffic and is a forest of concrete pillars holding up the buildings that are tucked away areas for utility and service access, as well as spots for dumpsters and garbage cans. This section is illuminated by orange streetlights that give a shadowy, dungeon-like look to the area. Homeless people live along Lower Wacker Drive because Upper Wacker shields it from rain and snow and other elements. Plus, there are areas in the tucked-away spots that provide walls and shelter. We would get cases from these areas, usually overdoses or pedestrians struck by automobiles, and occasionally homicides. One case I had from Lower Wacker was a 50-year-old homeless man found in a service area. His head was crushed. It was believed that he either got run over by a garbage truck or was crushed by a dumpster, but his head was flattened. I did his autopsy, tried to piece his head back together. I noticed during the external examination that he had multiple injuries to the back of his head and neck. We shaved the hair off the back of his head and exposed what turned out to be multiple chop wounds. Chop wounds are a type of sharp force injury that are very long, like an incised wound with abraded edges, but are shorter than stab wounds, and they usually have associated with them broken bones. They are caused by implements that are usually sharp and heavy with a thick cutting surface that's thicker than a knife, and these can be axes, machetes, meat cleavers, and things of that nature. This finding was unexpected. We had no information that he had been attacked, and he had definitely not been crushed by anything. Someone had hit him multiple times with an unknown weapon. I told the police my findings, and they did a thorough further investigation and found out the following. There had been a turf war over a space in Lower Wacker between 2 homeless men, one of which was the man who was now dead. They were vying for a spot near the dumpsters that was particularly protected from the elements. It also had a plug for electricity, and there was an exhaust vent which would provide heat during the cold winter months and cool air during the summer, so it was a really good location. And with real estate, we all know it's all about location, location, location. These 2 men both wanted the spot, and they ended up fighting over it. In the final showdown, one man showed up with his fists, whereas the other man showed up with a hatchet, and he beat the other man to death with his hatchet, hitting him in the back of the head over and over until he finally crushed his skull, causing multiple fractures and making his brains come out of his head, killing him. The findings from the autopsy and with the investigation, it made determining the cause of death easy. It was multiple chop wounds to the head and neck, and the manner of death was homicide. The other homeless man that killed him freely admitted to what he had done, getting a very nice spot in a prison cell. Finally, there is one more level of Wacker Drive, and that is Lower Wacker. It's beneath Lower Wacker, of course, and provides parking spaces for garbage trucks and space for other City of Chicago property, including used trash cans. And it had once been an area for street racing. So let's get back to the taxi ride. Like I said, I was heading to Upper Wacker for a deposition in a civil case. The case itself was a 21-year-old woman who had been a passenger in an automobile that had been in an accident. The claim was the accident was caused because the City of Chicago had not properly put out warning signs that an overpass was under construction, and the overpass ended abruptly, and where it was unfinished, there was probably a several-story drop after the road ran out. The individuals in the car accident didn't realize they were driving on a road that would end with a lengthy drop, and it was night, so they didn't see it was going to end, and they were driving at highway speeds. So when they were driving, the overpass suddenly disappeared, the car flew through the air and crashed to the ground. The decedent was a rear seat passenger. She survived, but she had damage to her cervical spine at the level of cervical vertebrae number 7 and thoracic vertebrae number 1. I've talked about this type of injury in the previous episode entitled Outburst, so if you want a more detailed explanation of this injury, check that episode out. This injury is very common for car accidents. Her spinal cord damage was actually more at the level of thoracic vertebrae number 1 than cervical vertebrae number 7, and she had incomplete injury at this level, which meant she still had minimal hand and arm movement, but no function from the chest down. And this meant she was wheelchair bound. On the day she died, she was working on Christmas cards at her computer. She would usually work there and typically have her wheelchair with the brakes on. But on this day, the brakes weren't on. And while she was working, her wheelchair rolled out of place, and she fell forward into a head-down position with her head between her knees. She tried to sit up, but wasn't strong enough, and was stuck in this folded-over, head-down position. She was found hours later, still like this, by a family member, and when they found her, she was dead. At autopsy, she had no evidence of injury or pressure ulcers. She did have the scars associated with her injuries, as well as scars associated with surgical interventions. Her head and upper chest exhibited congestion. There were petechial hemorrhages of the face, eyelids, and eyes. Again, petechial hemorrhages are pinpoint hemorrhages associated with a number of things, including strangulation, hangings, CPR, and gagging or retching. Her arms and legs exhibited atrophy. Internally, there was old damage to the spinal column and spinal cord at the level of cervical vertebrae number 7 and thoracic vertebrae number 1. She exhibited pulmonary congestion and edema. There were no other findings. Toxicology was negative. So why did she die? It was because of the head-down position she was in made it impossible for her to breathe normally. And this is called positional asphyxia. Positional asphyxia is a situation in which abnormal positioning of the body compromises the individual's ability to breathe, and this results in asphyxia, or lack of oxygen to the brain, that causes death. It can occur in a variety of ways, including wedging of the body in a confined space that causes the chest wall to not be able to move, or the neck can be flexed into a position, especially when the chin is touching the chest, which occludes the upper airway. I've seen this in a car accident where the roof of the car got pushed down into the individual who was buckled in place. Her head got forced into her chest, and that blocked her airway, and she asphyxiated. Positional asphyxia does not involve suspension like in hanging, nor does it involve crushing, which is like a significant weight of a motor vehicle landing on top of an individual, making it impossible for them to breathe. One article entitled Positional Asphyxia in Adults, a series of 30 cases from the Dade and Broward County, Florida Medical Examiner's Office, defined a criteria for making the diagnosis of positional asphyxia, and these include the following. 1. Finding of the victim in a position that does not allow for adequate respiration. This includes restrictive or confining positions, flexion of the head onto the chest, partial or complete external airway obstruction, and neck compression. 2. No evidence to implicate another person in the event, with scene examination and history review indicating the victim was responsible for inadvertently placing him or herself in this situation. 3. Inability of the victim to extract him or herself from the situation, for example, due to intoxication or dementia. 4. No evidence of internal airway obstruction from, for example, aspirated food. 5. No evidence of carbon monoxide or other suffocating gas inhalation. And 6. No evidence of significant cardiac disease. There are two groups that usually die from positional asphyxia, and these are infants or children, which is usually associated with accidental deaths from unsafe sleeping situations, particularly when they get trapped between a mattress and a wall. And of course, adults. Most adults that die from positional asphyxia are drunk or compromised from drugs, especially sedative drugs. They usually fall into a situation or collapse into an odd position that they are unable to get themselves out of due to their intoxication, and they asphyxiate. One particular position is known as the jackknife position, in which the head is typically downward with the rest of the body in a more upward position. These individuals are often trapped while climbing through a window. The autopsy of positional asphyxia is usually nonspecific. There can be intense congestion of the face and petechial hemorrhages of the eyelids and eye. And that was what was seen in this particular case. The cause of death was made complications of blunt force injuries. Manner of death, accident, with the complication being the fact that the injuries from the accident made her paraplegic with minimal use of her arms, and she was unable to extract herself from a position that caused her to asphyxiate. And that is why it was going to deposition. The family was suing the city of Chicago for the improper warning of the overpass that abruptly ended in a fall. At the deposition, it was my job to go in and describe what I found at autopsy and then be asked questions about it. And that's what I was going to do on that day. And that's why I needed to have a taxi, because I didn't have a car. So I called to have one come and pick me up at the medical examiner's office. When the cab showed up, it was a yellow cab, covered in dirt and salt from the treatments of the roads. When I sat down in the back of the cab driver said to me, "Where are you heading?" And I told him the address and that it was on Upper Wacker Drive. I then pulled out my notes for one more review of the case, not really paying attention. He locked all the doors and we started heading out at a high rate of speed. Then all of a sudden he said, "Hey, you're Dr. Crowns, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, that's who I am." And I continued to look at my notes, and we were going faster and faster down the road. And then the cab started zigzagging wildly. I was sliding around against the seatbelt. I thought he was missing potholes or something, and I looked up, and I had no idea where we were. I started to think to myself, I never told him what my name was. I never told the cab company when I called who I was. I just gave them a location. So how does he know my name? I looked up, and I noticed he was staring at me in the rear-view mirror and not really paying attention to the road. And when he noticed, I noticed him looking at me. He said, "You're Dr. Crowns, right?" And I said, "Well, yes, that is who I am." And he said, "Do you remember me? Do you know who I am?" And he was looking intensely at me in the rear view mirror as we were speeding down the street. I didn't recognize him at all. And I said, "No, I have no idea who you are." And he said, "You don't remember me, huh? It was at a trial. You don't remember the trial?" At that point, I had been in a few trials, and they were all homicides or murder cases, and I was concerned that he had been a murderer that was on trial that I had been in, and I had testified against him. And now he was free, driving me in a cab down the street. And I didn't know where I was, and I was locked in the cab, heading to who knows where. Hopefully not Lower Wacker or Lower Wacker, to be placed in a barrel, to be dumped in Lake Michigan. And then he said, "So you really don't remember me?" And I told him I was sorry, I just didn't. After several tense minutes and more speeding down the road and zigzagging, he said, "Well, I was one of the jurors." And as soon as he said this, a wave of relief swept across my body. And when we started talking about it, I did remember the case. And we talked about my findings and what other people had said during the trial and how him and the jury came to their decision. And in the end, he said, "You really don't remember me at all?" And I said to him, "I'm really sorry. I just don't." He said, "Well, that's too bad. I would have thought you would have remembered me, because I feel I have a distinctive face and a very impressive mustache." And while he was talking, I thought, well, he does have an impressive mustache. When we arrived at my destination, he thanked me for talking about the case with him and told me to have a good day. I paid for my ride, tipped him, and got out, and he took off, heading off into an unknown direction. I headed off to my deposition, never saw him again. My testimony at the deposition went well. It was uneventful. And eventually the family did get a settlement because the city was found at fault. My cab ride back to the medical examiner's office after the deposition was uneventful. The cab driver didn't recognize me. He didn't even talk to me. And in a kind of way, I like that much better. The next cab ride I'm going to talk about happened when I arrived at O'Hare Airport late at night on a cold, snowy evening in late October. I had arrived from Florida after taking my board examination in forensic pathology. The forensic pathology board exam is a test that lasts all day long. It comes in 3 parts: a written portion, a practical portion with pictures, and finally a glass microscopic slide portion where you take actual macroscopic slides and look at them under the microscope and answer questions. It's an exhausting, timed multiple-choice test consisting of hundreds of questions and usually starts around 8 a.m. and ends around 4 p.m. with an hour break for lunch. Back then, we always had to take the test in Tampa, Florida, at one urban center on Kennedy Boulevard. The testing center was this large, gray, drab room with cubicles. You'd sit at a cubicle with a computer and a large microscope. At the beginning of the test, they'd make an announcement about proper test etiquette and procedures, and they'd go over how to start the examination and talk about no crinkling candy wrappers, which can upset people. And then the test would start, the lights would dim, and you would log into the computer. That day when the test started, the person across from me started clicking their mouse madly, and all of a sudden they started saying, "Oh no, oh no." And the proctor walked over and asked, "What's wrong?" And they said, "My mouse doesn't work. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm losing time. This is terrible. Help me, help me, help me." And the proctor told them to calm down. We'll get this sorted out. And they did. They fixed the computer, and eventually everything went quiet. After the lunch break, the microscopic section began. In this section, you get a container of slides, and you bring it back to your microscope and start going through them. The test consists of 3 different boxes of slides. When I got out my first slide and put it under the microscope, it was a fungus that I instantly recognized, Aspergillus, with its beautiful 45-degree branching hyphae popping out in the lung tissue. The next slide was unburned gunpowder embedded in skin consistent with an intermediate-range gunshot wound. The rest of the slides continued to go my way, and time flew by. I completed the last section with little time to spare. And when I got done, I turned in my last box of slides, gathered my suitcase, and headed out to the airport shuttle. When I was riding to the airport, there was a number of other individuals who had just taken the test riding with me, and they were all discussing one of the questions, which was a question about kinetic energy. They had confused the formula, which is 1/2 mass times velocity squared, and had the velocity and mass switched. I didn't engage in the conversation, even though I knew they were wrong. It didn't matter at that point. I just wanted to go home. I was exhausted, and when I finally got on the plane and it took off, I quickly fell asleep. The plane landed in North Carolina because I had a layover there, and there must have been some sort of bad weather because I was stuck there for hours. When I finally landed in Chicago, it was a little after 1 a.m., and I had arrived several hours later than I should have. I only had my carry-on, so I headed to the taxi area to get a ride home. The normally busy airport was actually quiet and empty. Businesses were closed, and there were very few employees milling about. I stepped outside, and the cold air instantly made its presence known. I walked over to the cab stand kiosk. There was an employee sitting inside of it, in a heavy winter jacket and hat. She looked tired, and when I walked up, she looked a little irritated. I told her I needed to get a taxi to go to the western suburbs, Lyle to be exact. She said, "Did you schedule one?" I said no. She said at this time of night, there were none available. She would have to call for one, and it would take some time before one would get there. And I thought, well, that's quite an ending for such a wonderful day. But then, all of a sudden, a person yelled, "Hey, you need a ride?" I looked over, and there was this tan car that was sitting in front of all these other cabs that had been called for. And the driver again said, "You need a ride?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do need a ride." And he said, "I'll take you wherever you want to go." I was incredibly tired at this point, not really thinking about it. And I said, "That works for me." And I started walking over to the tan car. One of the cab drivers in the line of cabs that were spoken for got out of his cab and he said, "Don't ride with him. You don't know him. He's not a cabbie." The man from the tan car said to the cabbie, "Shut the F up. You don't get to talk to him and stay out of my business." And the cabbie said, "Hey, you shut up." And then the tan car guy and the cabbie got into a major shouting match. I stood in the street, bewildered, not knowing what to do. And the tan car driver looked at me and he said, "Get in the damn car. You can ride with me. Don't listen to him." And I thought, okay, I'll get in the car. As I was opening the passenger side door, the cab driver that he was arguing with said again to me, "Don't get in there. You don't know who he is." And the tan car driver again said, "Shut the F up." As he got in the car, slamming the door shut, he turned to me and said, "Don't listen to them." I buckled up. I was quite tired, both emotionally and mentally. I was just exhausted from the long day of testing and flying and all the other things that had happened. And it was really just a relief to be able to sit in a car and think I was heading home. The driver of the tan car locked all the doors and started speeding off, and he said to me, "Where are we going?" And I told him I lived out in Lisle, in the western suburbs, and to just take me to the Eisenhower Expressway to 355 and get off at the Ogden exit, and then I would tell him where to go from there. He sped off at an incredibly fast speed, and when we got on the expressway, he was making lane changes, left, right. It was incredibly erratic. I had my trusty flip phone, and I got it out and texted Beth, and let her know that I had landed and gotten in a car, but it wasn't a cab, and I was heading home. She texted back, "If it's not a taxi, what kind of car are you in? What have you gotten into?" And at that point, my phone went dead. I started looking around, and if you've ever ridden in a taxi, they usually have identification cards or things of that nature, so you know they are licensed and bonded or whatever to be a taxi driver. He had none of this. I noticed there was no meter in the cab as well, so there was no way to really document the ride or see how much it was costing. I just realized at that moment I'd gotten in someone's car, someone random. I literally got in a stranger's car like a child enticed by candy, and I wasn't sure what to do. He was going 90 miles per hour. I could see the exit sign for Ogden Avenue coming up, and I told him, "Get off here," which he did, and then he said to me, "Where do we go from here?" I continued to give him directions, and as we drove along the snowy neighborhood streets, I could tell he was getting irritated. And he kept asking, "How much further?" I started thinking, what have I really done? What if he's taking me home to rob me and murder me and my family? What if I'm going to end up as a cautionary tale on 2020 or Nightline or the Nancy Grace Show about how stupid I was to get in someone's random car at O'Hare Airport after midnight? I thought at that moment, I gotta get out of this car. And I said to him, "How much is this going to cost?" And he said, $60 sound okay? I said, "Yeah, that sounds great." I had exactly $70 in my pocket in cash. We got to a stop sign and he told me, "Where do I go from here?" I threw the cash on the center console. I opened the door and ran through the ankle-deep snow into a neighborhood near my home. I looked back, and he turned into the neighborhood looking for me. He rolled down his windows and started saying, "Hey, get back in here." "What are you doing?" I cut through someone's backyard, found a grove of pine trees, and hid behind a snowbank. He couldn't see me at this point. He was driving slowly, looking for me, and I sat there quietly in the pine trees, not moving. After a while, he turned around in a driveway and left the neighborhood. I watched his taillights vanish into the darkness, and I waited a little longer to make sure he hadn't circled back. I figured when my hands and feet had gone numb, he was probably not coming back. I walked the rest of the way to my house, and when I finally got home and opened the door, Beth greeted me, and she said, "Oh, thank goodness you're home." And that was the end of that ride. And that brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you learned something, like take an Uber, and I hope you were entertained. Until the next time.